Thank you so much for coming out this afternoon. I really appreciate you being here and giving me an opportunity to talk about my research with you. I would like to thank the folks with the Michael Davis Lecture Series for inviting me to come here and share this research with you. I'd like to thank Laura and Keith. Can you hear me? Yeah. Oh, you need me to speak louder? Yes. Is this loud enough? Okay. Okay. So again, I would like to thank the Michael Davis folks for inviting me here to share my research with you. It really is quite an honor and really humbling to be here. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is get started. And hopefully you can hold the questions until the end, and I'll be more than happy to answer them. I think I should probably start out by saying that I started this research project as an undergraduate at the University of Florida. And so I just want you to take a moment and look at this picture and look at the two water fountains and tell me what you notice about it, or even just think about what do you notice? They're connected, right? Even though they're supposed to be separate, right? They're connected by a pipe. Separate, not so much, right? This one clearly doesn't look like it has any kind of cooling system connected to it, but this one does. And this is a really nice picture to really start to talk about what was going on during Jim Crow, right? So there's this notion that segregation was really about separate water fountains, sitting in the back of the bus, going to different schools, but it was so much more than just that. So much more than just that, all right? So as an undergraduate, you know what it's like to be young. I thought I knew everything about Jim Crow, so when I went into the community to talk to my folks, I have to tell you, it was quite stunning. Some of the stories that these folks shared with me that I'm going to share with you today about what they went through. Some of the narratives that I'm going to share with you can be quite painful to listen to. I apologize in advance, but I constantly remind myself if these folks could live through this, then the least that I can do is share it, right? They were willing to share it with me for me to share it with you. They were very explicit. They wanted folks to know what they had lived through, right? And so that's what I am here to do. And it's kind of interesting that we didn't get, as a country, enough regret to apologize for what these folks went through until 2008, I think, when President Obama came into office. There was an apology on the Senate floor apologizing for slavery and Jim Crow. Folks were still alive at that time. And it was kind of like this haphazard kind of lukewarm apology. And I say that to preface what I'm getting ready to share with you, because it'll just give you an indication of how much these folks dealt with during the time of Jim Crow segregation. So as I said, I went into the community as an undergraduate with this research question because I really wanted to find out. I knew something about Jim Crow. I wanted to find out, well, how did people cope with it? What strategies did they use? And were they passing those strategies on to their children and grandchildren to help them to kind of cope with stuff that was going on? And so, you know, when you go in the field as a researcher, you go in with one thing, but you come out with something totally different. And that's what happened with me. I thought I had is this a clicker? Okay, so the methodology that I used qualitative research methods. I went in and did interviews that lasted about an hour. Initially, I went into the community based upon my mentor, who had said he had sent several people into the community to try to find out about the experiences of African Americans who lived through Jim Crow. None of them were successful. Being an African American woman of my age, I think that kind of gave me an extra trust level with these folks. So they were willing to sit down and talk with me about their experience. So I went into some of the social clubs, I went to churches, I introduced the project, and I asked people to sign up. I went to several events where I kind of served them, you know, a couple of social events that they had for elderly African American women particularly, and I played games with them, I served them food to kind of build up a rapport. So when I came into their homes, they would be willing to open up and talk with me, right? And it worked. So I started out with the interviews, and I'll talk about these historical black newspapers in a minute, because they come into play later on after I'd already gone out into the field and I had collected quite a few interviews. Something was gnawing at me. I was missing something, right? And I knew that I was missing something. Once you start analyzing stuff, and I'm looking at people, and I'm looking at their body language, and I'm looking at the way they're responding, and I said, there's something that I'm missing. This isn't just about coping. And that's how I got where I am today. I swear, I don't know. Help me with these slides. Okay. As you can see, technology is not my strong point. I got my PhD in sociology. They didn't tell me that I would have to be a technology major in order to do this stuff, right? Okay, so the participants I interviewed, it's really over 100, but I say nearly 100 African Americans. A number of these folks that I interviewed during this time have already passed away, which really goes to that urgency to get their stories down, right? And record what they went through. So some of them were doctors, lawyers, domestic workers, and it was a diverse group of folks, right? SES, their socioeconomic status, high end and low end. In the Southeast, there were 52 respondents, 37 women, 15 men. Most of them were over the age of 70. Several of them were in their early 50s until 69. And in the Southwest, so I conducted 2 projects, one in the Southeast and one in the Southwest, right, to see what folks in the Southeast were saying versus those in the Southwest. So I interviewed about 40 responded, 25 women, and notice most of the folks that I spoke to were women. Most of the folks that I spoke to were women. And that has a lot to do, to a certain degree, with what was going on in Jim Crow. With men being lynched, young men being arrested and put in prison, being killed, disappearing. So there was this all-out kind of assault, right, that we kind of still see today to a certain degree, yeah, about young black bodies, particularly male bodies. So as I said, typically I interviewed folks in their home where they felt comfortable and safe. I put that in quotes, and you'll see why in a minute. Comfortable and safe in quotes. Think about feeling safe in your own home, in your own space, with your door locked, right? That wasn't something that African Americans had the luxury of feeling when they lived during Jim Crow. Even in your own home, you weren't really safe or comfortable, because there was always that fear. The interviews consisted of a series of several open-ended questions, and I really started out asking them just kind of general questions. Where were you born? Did you grow up with your mother and your father? Do your children live here? To kind of start this rapport, to let them know that I really did care about what they had to say. You know, I made eye contact. I asked them where they wanted me to sit. There were some folks that didn't want to be recorded and who needed constant reassurance, right, that their story wasn't going to be connected with them and that what they were telling me wouldn't get out and it wouldn't come back in retaliation for them. 50-some years, right, after Jim Crow laws had ended. Some of the findings in the narratives were rape, attempted rape, lynchings, loss of land. And a lot of times when we think about traumatic events, we don't necessarily associate it with the loss of land. But the loss of land, according to the literature on trauma, is a high predictor of someone developing these after long-lasting psychological effects. Losing your land is huge, right? Because most folks, right, get their wealth and the things that they pass on from generation to generation from land ownership. And so there were a lot of African Americans that I spoke with that talked about their land being taken. Even knowing who has their land didn't guarantee them the ability to get it back. Some of the reactions to the traumatic events were rage, shame, anger. Some coped with the traumatic event. And when I say a racial traumatic event, a traumatic event is one thing, but a racial traumatic event means that race plays a huge part in why this event is happening. So the perpetrator, to a certain degree, is going to be of the dominant group, and the person who's the victim will be the person that's being oppressed, a member of the group. There was the resistance, denial of the event. Some folks, it was really interesting. There were these two sisters, and this is the way I do my lecture. I hope this is okay with you. I have to interject when I'm remembering stuff because I think that really gives it a little bit more teeth. There were two sisters that I interviewed at the same time in the Southwest, and they told me that they had never heard anything about the Ku Klux Klan until they saw it on Oprah. I was like, oh, Jesus, really? I said, wow, yeah, it was this Oprah episode and so on and so on. But in order for them to deal with the stuff that they had been through, you know, it's like this denial. I mean, this conscious denial that anything ever happened. And the shame that's associated with these things happening to you, where you feel helpless to do anything about it, where you pretty much have to kind of just let it happen. And that's the best way to get past it. So, segregation stress syndrome is something that I came up with after being out in the field for quite some time. And like I said, I came home and I had this gnawing feeling that I was missing something. And it was one particular interview that I did. And this woman, she was answering all the questions really well, and you know, everything was going nicely. Her two little babies were there, her grandbabies. And I asked her, so what was your first experience with a white person? She started sweating. She started breathing heavy. I could see that she was having some anxiety. She started getting nervous. I mean, these physical kind of signs of PTSD, right? Her voice started shaking. She wasn't sure if she wanted to answer the question. She needed reassurance right after I said that. That was the first time I had interjected the group, the white folks, the dominant group, that they had been the victim of some sort of racial violence. She kind of sealed it for me. I knew that I had some work to do. I had figured out then that these are symptoms of people who are suffering from psychological consequences of dealing with years and years and years of violence. And one thing about segregation stress syndrome that I really want you to focus on, right, is that it is this underlying fear that at any given moment, for no particular reason, without any warning, somebody could do you harm, right? Kill you or hurt somebody in your family. That's key. That feeling never goes away for these folks. And I'll show you in a minute how it kind of manifests itself. So segregation stress syndrome is similar to PTSD. Some of the high strong predictors are rape, disaster, war, terrorism. And so I focus on it as a collective experience. So I'm focusing it on like this macro. PTSD literature focuses a lot on the individual experience. But for my use of it, it's more about the collective, a group of folks that lived during a particular time that had the same sort of experience for years and years and years that left them with these long-lasting consequences. And the symptoms of it varies based on the severity of the experience, the length of the experience, the earliest exposure to the trauma. There were some children, and I'll talk about this as well, that were sexually assaulted when they were 5, 6, 7 years old in their own homes. So this notion of this safe and comfortable in your own home doesn't apply for them, right? You could witness an event, you could hear about it, you could experience it, and those are some of the ways in which this trauma gets experienced. You don't necessarily, you probably notice, you don't have to actually be there. Somebody could just be talking about it, and you could experience some of the actual exposure to it and develop segregation stress syndrome. So some of the survivors exhibited fear, mistrust, avoidance of those that inflicted the violence on them, avoidance of settings that would trigger a painful memory. I don't drink out of water fountains. I never knew why. You know, I won't tell you my age, but I was old enough to live through some of this stuff. And I had no idea that my not drinking out of water fountains had everything to do with being warned as a young kid by my mother, who's from North Carolina, my dad's from New Orleans, that I should not drink out of the water fountain. Because if you can't read, right, and you're like 4 or 5, and you drink out the wrong water fountain, you're in trouble. You're in trouble, and your family's in trouble. So to keep children safe, there was these warnings that folks did to protect their kids, just like kind of now. And I always like to bring things back to the present because it's all connected. It's a continuous cycle. It doesn't end. It's like a house. It's the same old house, but you just repainted it, right? This is what we're dealing with here. So there's this hypervigilance, this constant needing to be reassured that it wouldn't get back to them. Because remember, the folks that committed these acts of violence are still alive too, right? Just like the folks who were the victims of it, the folks who did it are still alive. And in a lot of instances, they all live in the same community still. They see each other all the time. And folks know what they did. And the people who were the victims know who did it, right? But they know that there's not anything that they could do about it through the legal system. Like I mentioned, some of the physical symptoms that they exhibited were sweating, trembling, get emotionally upset when they recalled it. Some folks just had this blank kind of emotional numbness, like there wasn't anybody there. It was just this talking. Have you ever seen someone who's just talking and you realize that something horrible has happened because something is gone? That's what I saw in several of the folks that I interviewed. This kind of emotional numbness, like I've checked out. I'm here, but I've kind of checked out emotionally. And during the course of this time, when folks would cry pretty hysterically, I wasn't expecting it. I mean, it really threw me for a loop. As a young researcher, I hadn't anticipated what some of these folks were going to tell me. So there were times when I really tried to just say, listen, let's just stop. You know, we don't have to go any further. They would not stop. They said, I need to talk about this. I need to let people know what I lived through. I need for you to share my story, right? And so that's what I did, and that's what I'm doing. So this is the first quote that I'm going to read for you. It's on the handout. There's a couple that I won't read, but I'm going to start off reading a few of these quotes. And I want to preface this one. I went into this woman's home, and I don't know, as growing up, I always remember that, like, I'm a light kind of person. I like light. So when I went into a lot of folks' home and the shades were drawn, it was so dark in there, you couldn't see. And I always wondered in my mind, why? Open up the shades, let the sun in. I was so naive. I went into this woman's home. It was a sunny day in the South. It was 12 noon, and it was pitch dark, right? And the only light that was there was coming from her television set, and her husband was sitting there, and he was watching TV, kind of being very watchful, giving her the okay that, you know, it's okay to talk, right? And so I realized later that what happened was Black folks during this time, they kept their blinds closed because they didn't want anybody to see them inside. Because just because you're inside your house, if somebody sees you, that doesn't mean that they don't feel, that they can come in and do what they want. And that's what happens. So you keep your blinds closed so people can't see you. So during these times when the Ku Klux Klan would have parades, people would close their blinds, turn off all their lights, be very quiet, get down on the floor so that they wouldn't know that you were in your house, to kind of prompt them, to come in if they saw movement or saw you there. And this was kind of like their strategy for addressing this stuff. They hid, remained quiet. And those parades that went on in these black communities were pretty scary, with the bullhorns and the yelling and the screaming, just forms of intimidation. And these elderly folks had reason to be fearful. Because you know some of the history of the country, you know what the Ku Klux Klan can be capable of. But keep in mind, the Ku Klux Klan, these were like folks' neighbors that just put on a sheet. They knew who they were. I mean, it was the judges, the police officers, the guy down the street that owns the store. So these weren't kind of strangers in white sheets. They were people that they knew. That's how kind of fearful it could be. Because I know that it's you. I mean, I see you every day. But what are you going to do? Hide. Remain quiet. Shut your blinds and let them finish and move on. So I spoke with this woman, and she wouldn't let me tape record her. I had 2 tape recorders. She refused for me to tape record her. She was one of the folks that needed this constant reassurance over and over and over again. So I had a paper and I just scribbled stuff down that she said. And she shared her first experience with a white person with me. And I'm going to read it for you now. If you want to follow along on the handout, you can. So she said, "My mother would wash clothes for Mr. Smith back when I was 16. I would help my mother by using an iron to press the clothes. He always wanted his shirts cleaned and pressed. Back then you didn't have bleach, you had to use lye. And we used a washing board to scrub the clothes. I remember one day, I don't know what happened, but there was one spot on the corner of his collar, and he started cussing. He just kept cussing and yelling at my mama. I was so scared for my mama. She just kept saying, I'm sorry, sir, I'm sorry. Sir, it won't happen again, I'm sorry. Yes, sir, I'm sorry. It won't happen again. She was begging and pleading with him. And I remember that being my first memory. I mean, just think about it. You're a young child going to work with your mother. And there's one little spot, right? We see the violence in this. And when we talk about violence, it's not just physical violence, right? It's the violence that comes along with these kind of harsh words. The violence that comes along with psychologically kind of intimidating someone. There's that fear, right, of something bad happening to her mother. And her mother, knowing that her child was there, tried to kind of deflate it as quickly as she could. And she was able to, but in all instances, it wouldn't get deflated. I mean, he could have beat her up or done anything to her, right there with her child watching. So these are the kind of stories, and she wasn't the only one that talked about kind of witnessing these racial traumatic events. So this child witnessed this racial traumatic event over 50 years ago when she was a young girl, and she remembered it like it had happened yesterday and expressed it. I mean, I could feel her fear, right? I could feel that she was afraid for her mother. So the next one I'm going to read, again, comes back to this being comfortable and safe in your own home. This responded She talked for hours. I actually went back several times to visit her. Her brother, who I'm getting ready to talk with you about, Richard, I'm going to tell you something that happened to him afterwards, okay? So this woman was over 70. She had pretty much lived in the same neighborhood the whole time that she grew up there and stayed there, left a little while and came back. And so she tells me about something that happened one Sunday afternoon after her and her family had just gotten back from church. So this is what she said. I remember one Sunday afternoon, a white man came to our house. I must have been about 15. This man knocked on the door. My mom was sleeping. My brother was in the next room sleeping, so I answered the door, and the man looked like he was spellbound. It frightened me, so I started backing up, and he started following me. I ran. He was following me. My brother sat up to see what was happening. He came behind him. I can remember my sister saying, "Oh, no, no, Richard, no, no, no." He was going to hurt him. I ran up under the house and hid. He walked in the backyard looking for me, and eventually he went on and got in the car. My dad wanted to know who he was. I was never able to tell him who he was. I couldn't remember telling him what he even looked like. It frightened me. I was young, and it frightened me. I knew that these things happened, and I didn't want that to happen to me. It was terrible. It was very frightening. My brother wouldn't have been able to do anything about it. So here we see this young woman, right, has gone to church with her family. Her mother and her brother are in their house, their home. This guy just comes to the door and comes in. The brother wants to attack him and fight him and get him out and keep him from doing whatever it is he felt like he wanted to do to his sister. The other sister stops him because she knew that if that young man did anything to this guy who came into their house to do whatever, sexual assault or whatever, that if the brother fought the man, then the whole family would be in jeopardy, that their house might be burnt down, that he might come back and kill them, they might get arrested. It wasn't going to end good for them. So to allow him to do whatever he wanted to do was the best solution. And a lot of women were faced with this type of situation. Women who had husbands and men would come into their home selling whatever goods, right, would rape them. And these men would have to look at this child knowing that it was not theirs, that it was biracial, but knowing that their wife didn't have a choice, right? I mean, think about living in this patriarchal system. And men are really socialized to care and protect their daughters, their mothers, their wives. That wasn't what happened for black men during this era. Some men stayed when their wives turned up with biracial children. Several left because it was just too difficult to protect them. It was too challenging to protect black women. I mean, for some of them, it was more than they could even handle because it goes directly to what we learned about being a man and all of those things. And that's part of where the shame comes from. Not being able to do anything and knowing that you can't do anything. So this young man was very boisterous, participated in the civil rights movement, all sorts of things, was very successful. He was a brilliant young man, a bright future. One day he disappeared. And they found his body 2 weeks later in a refrigerator. Somebody had murdered him, lured him out of his house, brutally murdered him, and stuffed him in a refrigerator. And she believes that part of why this happened was because he was so boisterous. He fought back against these, oppressive circumstances. He fought back and fought for social justice. And he would stand on the corner, she said, and shout it out to the roof, and everybody knew. And so somebody one day lured him out of his home, lured him out to a secluded place, and took his life. Eventually, they found the man who did it. I believe he went to jail, but still, that wasn't enough to comfort this woman. She cried hysterically. She loved her brother, right? And the way that he ended up, she said that her and her mother were sitting in the living room. It was late at night, and a news flash came on that they had found his body. And she said her mother fell apart. And she was never right after that. Right? And just imagine a mother hearing about her son being found in a refrigerator, in his body, pretty much, decomposing. But she did say that in spite of everything, she said he fought back. My brother fought back, right? There were signs that there was a struggle, and he did try to fight. So even in the midst of all of this, there's still that feeling of, listen, I'm empowered, because I knew he fought all the time, and he fought this as well. So this one, so we have this attempted rape, and here we have this rape. And so what happened when I interviewed a lot of these folks is, in my mind, thinking about what went on with slavery, I had a sense that there were a number of folks that must have been faced with some sort of sexual assault or rape or something. But there was only one or two or three folks who really kind of mentioned it, and it's always somebody else's family member, right? It was always, Miss May's daughter up the street got raped, or so-and-so. It was never like their family. And so this is what led me into the newspaper articles, and I'm going to talk about the newspaper articles in a minute. But let me read you this story that this woman shared with me about her aunt. This one you also have. So she says that in later years, my mother and her sisters would never tell us anything. But I have a cousin, but I called her Aunt Belle. She told me that this white prostitute across the street, Miss Ann, my auntie Celeste worked for her. And she was over there working one day, and this white man that owned a store a block up the street came to see Miss Ann. He was married. Miss Ann wasn't there, so he raped my aunt. And she paused. And my aunt got pregnant. And when she got pregnant, she told her family what had happened. She told them that he had raped her that day, and they went to talk to him. And you know what they did? They told her that she needed to leave town. They said, you gotta get her out of town. This is what they did to blacks. The white men would rape the black girls, and if the black girls got pregnant, the families would have to send them out of town to have the babies. That's what happened in that situation in the family. She would tell me other families that it happened to. Our family wasn't the only one. You see, they wanted to hide everything, and that is why they wanted to do. My mother or my aunt, they would have never told me about, her situation. They would have gone to their grave with it. So these young women who got raped, so now you've been traumatized, and you have to leave town. You have to leave your social network. You have to leave your social support. You have this man who is in the neighborhood. Remember, he just lived up the street. He didn't leave town, right? He didn't serve a second in jail. He wasn't even arrested. But she's now saddled with this child, and her life has pretty much been kind of spelled out to a certain degree. And I have to say, there were folks in the black community, and I think part of the way in which some folks, especially black men, framed these situations in their minds, right, was that folks were having an affair, right? These black women were having affairs with these white men to gain some sort of, access to materials or whatever. And so in your mind as a man, there's this cognitive dissonance that goes on, right? In order to, accept the fact that as a man, I can't protect my daughters and my wife, they had the power to decide whether they wanted to be with these men or not. And clearly that was not the case. There's a pretty famous case, Ruby McCullum. Has anybody ever heard of Ruby McCullum? Ruby McCullum was an African-American woman, one of the richest women in Live Oak, Florida. She got ill, and the doctor, the local white doctor, came to treat her. Doc Adams. Doc Adams started raping Ruby McCullum. And this went on for years. Ruby had a husband. She was rich. Even having money couldn't protect you. So he was raping her, and she decided one day after her second pregnancy with him, so she had a little baby, Loretta, and Loretta was biracial. Clearly, Sam wasn't the father. Sam was her husband. So Ruby went to Dr. Adams and told him that she wanted it to stop. And when he told her that he wasn't going to, she went home, came back with a gun, and shot him 4 times in the doctor's office. Shot him dead. And she was pregnant with her second child. But that's not even the end of the story. What happened after that, you would think that they would have lynched her, but they couldn't. You have this wealthy black woman and this doctor who's now elected senator in Live Oak, Florida, who's been shot dead, and nobody could believe that Doc Adams would sleep with this woman. And so they took her to another town. She was pregnant. The next day, her husband, Sam, who fled Live Oak with the children, had a heart attack and died. How convenient, right? She stayed in a mental institution for 20 years. They wanted to execute her. They didn't. She told them that he raped her. They wouldn't listen. It was an all-white jury. And she was the one that was having an affair. That astounded me when people told me that when I interviewed them. Because this is a prime example of the way this stuff gets framed and the language that we use to describe something that is clearly not this consensual relationship. So she lost the baby. She stayed in prison for 20 years. Her daughters live in New Jersey somewhere, and they don't want to talk about it. They promised her grandchildren, her daughter, that they wouldn't talk about it. Because still there's a lot of facts that aren't known. James Brolin and Barbara Streisand are in the process of making a major motion picture about Ruby McCullum. It's a pretty powerful story about a black woman, I believe, who decided that enough was enough. She knew that if she had another baby, Sam would leave her because he told her so. And so she felt like her back was up against the wall. So it wasn't just poor women, right? The wealthiest woman in the world could not be protected. So, and I said that to say that historically, the whole notion of black women's kind of, morality, there's a lot of stereotypes about black women, right? And when I looked into the newspaper article, and several people said this when I interviewed them, they talked about the fact that this woman, Elizabeth Smith, this guy talked about the fact that she was going to a sanctified church around the corner, and she got kidnapped by this white guy, and he took her out in the woods and sodomized and raped her. He never spent a day in jail, and she wasn't married or anything at the time. You see what's going on here? It's like these are good women, right? That they weren't married, they were going to sanctified churches, but it happened to them anyway. There wasn't anything that they did to provoke it. And when they talked about children in the newspaper articles, they say she was one of the best in our race. She was a good girl. She was a great student, but this happened to her anyway. So there's always this kind of preface to say, right, that these folks didn't deserve what happened to them, kind of like defending them, right? So, after the Miss Ann story, I started to think about, I know that there was stuff going on. So I said, let me just look in the newspaper databases. I'm telling you, I was floored when hundreds and hundreds of newspaper clippings came up with all these incidences of rape and sexual assault. You know, a 62-year-old man charged with rape of an 8-year-old girl. A white man abducted 2 black sisters. The 11-year-old is in a sanitarium in serious condition due to the assault, and her 17-year-old sister is at home suffering from exposure and severe nervous shock. So he raped the 11-year-old while the 17-year-old watched. And he didn't serve a moment in jail. And they were just walking down the street. Again, there it goes that at any given moment, without warning or reason, you could be in harm's way. A 16-year-old is raped, and a man is allowed to leave town. And you notice these newspapers, Chicago Defender. There were northern newspapers that were reporting all of these rapes to try to get some attention to what was going on in the South, which is why Ruby McCullum didn't hang from a tree, because it would have gotten national news, and it would have really exposed all the stuff that was going on in the South that people didn't really know about. An 11-year-old raped delivering clothes, and it goes on and on and on. There was one child who was 5 years old. I'm sorry, I hate to be graphic, but she was raped in her home after coming home from school, and her mother was down the street. So these folks are suffering. And we can kind of see why, right? During the era of Jim Crow, in these newspaper articles, this was the time before they didn't publish these young folks' names. So their names, right, and their age, where they lived, and everything is posted in these newspaper articles. So if you wanted to find them, you probably could. There's some scholars that had actually used these newspaper article databases, published books with these children's names in it. How is that possible? Because think about our woman before. These folks are still in fear, so now you got my name, right? You know where I live, you know who you are, and now it's published in a book. And so that's a whole nother set of trauma going on. There's no protection for the trauma and no protection for the stuff that happens after you're already traumatized. So that's why I chose not to use the names of any folks in the articles that I published, the book. I was very careful about not giving away any identifying information about these folks, right? They deserve to be protected, and they deserve to be protected now. So you have rape, but also loss of land. So again, in terms of Jim Crow, you know, part of the push for civil rights and desegregation had more to do with folks wanting to have access to more things for their children. It didn't have anything to do with folks wanting to sit in the water or, you know, at the counter or drinking out the same water fountain. It was really wanting to have access to some of the resources that folks had. So there were several cases during the course of this time. This one is in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where entire communities were wiped out. So according to Benjamin Browser, more than 1,000 people, 97% of a county's black population, were driven out over a period of about 2 months. They owned nearly 2,000 acres of farmland, nearly all of which they were forced to sell or abandon. The county's 5 black churches were burned, and racial cleansing occurred across the nation. So they were forced to leave the South and go to the North and basically leave everything behind. And there were several counties that this happened in. These are some places where they had racial expulsion: in Indiana, in Texas, Tennessee, Arkansas, Kentucky, North Carolina, and in Georgia. I mean, if I put them all up here, I'd be here all day, right? And so this goes back to my whole thing, the words that we use to explain something. How is this a great migration? You have these racial explosions going on where folks are given 24 hours to leave town or lose your life. And so the notion, and this is what Elliot Gibson talked about, this notion that folks freely and willingly left everything that they owned and their family and everything to go up north because they just wanted better job opportunities. Yes, that might have been the case for some folks, but this exodus out of the South had everything to do with racial violence and fear for your life. And so there was a place in Forsyth County in Georgia where at least half a dozen surrounding counties were also burned out. So it wasn't just the county that you lived in, it was the surrounding county. And that's how these people ended up going to the north in most instances. So it's not really the Great Migration. I would say it's more of like the great, expulsion of black people off their land, right? I mean, yeah, come on. It's like calling an apple an orange. It's still an apple. I mean, you can call it an orange, but that's not really accurate, right? I mean, that's just a way to kind of lighten it up because I know it's pretty heavy out there right now, right? Okay. So, and when I think about folks losing their land during Jim Crow, to bring it back home, it reminds me of the housing crisis that we had several years ago. Here again, we have the house painted a different color because black folks and folks of color and poor people were targeted by these organizations, these corporations, these banks, these mortgage companies, and they knew that the loans would not fly and that the folks wouldn't be able to sustain it. So you have all these folks who thought that they had finally achieved the American dream to turn around and lose everything. Again. And who went to jail? Nobody. So this whole notion of people not being held accountable, it's not something new in these communities, right? It's something that has been kind of happening all along, in the Jim Crow South now. So when folks see these young black men getting shot to death, nobody goes to jail, it's just a painful reminder of what they thought they had lived through. Here again, and it conjures up and triggers all the things that they remember before. It's that trigger, right? It's that trigger, because in terms of lynching, for the most part, people really just trying to protect their kids. One woman told me on any given day, you could go through a black community and see a young man hanging from a tree. And they call these trees lynch hammock, right? There's something that is sacred to a certain degree about these trees for the folks who hung people from them. There was a case, I think you'll remember the Genesis, the 6 young men. Do you guys remember Genesis? Okay, so what triggered the whole thing was these young men were sitting under a tree. There's that tree. And the white students said that they couldn't sit under that tree because that was their tree, right? So there's that symbol, right? And so that next day they came and there was 3 nooses hanging from the tree and the young black boys beat up one of the white students. And so they got, I think, 10 years in jail. I don't know how it all ended up, but these trees, you can find these trees, these kind of trees that are deemed as sacred trees all throughout the South and the North. And to call it lynch hammock, when I think of a hammock, I think about laying down, chilling out, right? With 2 trees in between me, on a nice little kind of swing. So there's that name again, calling something other than what it really is. It's a lynching tree. People's bodies hang from it. And I think that the thing that really concerned me about this too is that it's not just the black folks that are getting damaged. These young children who had picnics around these hanging bodies, waiting for body parts to be cut off and given to them, as they smiled, that really is compromising a child's humanity. Because you're not seen as a human being, and there's effects for that as well. that I think needs to be unpacked by maybe somebody else. So this is a quote from a woman. And she talked about a lot of stuff, and then she talked about these two young boys. She said they used to hang people. The last two I know was, she gave me their names, but as I said, I didn't write it down. She said they caught them with a white girl. I think they were fooling around with the girl all the time, and she got caught. So they hung him. They didn't put it in the paper. The whites just went in, broke into the home, and just grabbed them while they were sleeping. They said that the girl said that they had raped her. And I asked her, I said, well, was there a trial? She said, there was no trial. Those boys were teenagers. They might have been about 19 and 20. They were young. So here again, you know, you have this kind of, and it painfully reminds me of what's going on in this country right now with these shootings, you know. And, you know, when I think about segregation stress syndrome, I think about the fact that, you know, there is some data out there with Holocaust survivors that talks about the fact that, you know, and I'll talk about this in a second, that there's kind of this intergenerational transmission of trauma, but it's in the DNA, right? It gets passed on through the DNA. And I think about Holocaust survivors, and I think about all that they went through, and it was horrific, what they lived through. And I also think about African Americans, but their stuff hasn't stopped. It hasn't stopped. Here we have it. It hasn't stopped. It continues on. So when do we get an opportunity to really heal? Because it hasn't stopped. And so that's why I really think that it's important that when clinicians get an opportunity to have these folks come into their space and they're looking for help, that is really important. You have that one opportunity, just that one time, to pull this person in and give them the help that they need, because there is no cure for segregation stress syndrome. There's only treatment. And some of these folks have gone out and tried to get treatment, but they went in and the clinician said, there's nothing wrong with you, you're paranoid, you're this, you're that. They didn't respect them, so they left and they never went back. That can't happen anymore, right? I mean, these clinicians, they have a pretty tough job, but I think that as a society, we can do more to train them to handle these folks and work with them and train them how to show respect and how to listen to help them get through this stuff. Because it's not going away. And you have a whole nother generation or two of folks who are going to be hopefully seeking help, because the stress that these folks live under and this constant fear of death is really shortening folks' life. And creating these situations where you have all these chronic health illnesses, high blood pressure, heart disease, stroke, and all sorts of stuff. So one of the ways that folks talked about coping was being obedient. There was a young woman, well, she wasn't young, but she was a grandmother. She had 2 little grandbabies there when I interviewed her. And she talked about the fact that, you know, she had been taught all her life to be obedient, to do whatever white folks tell you to do. They tell you to do it, you just say yes sir, no sir, do it. And she said that I have had a lot of training. I have had a lot of instruction from my foreparents. And she said, that's what I tell my children and my grandchildren, who were sitting right there. Be obedient. Do whatever they tell you to do. Don't fight back. Don't be smart. Don't flip off at the tongue, right? And so the ways in which they cope is being passed on to these young folks. And in the minds of these elderly African Americans, there's more than enough evidence to show that it needs to be continued, because it all just looks the same. And they expressed that when I interviewed them. And so, this is Rosa Parks. there were a lot of folks who talked about resistance. And I had a conversation, and I shared this with Dr. Wyatt, I think it was yesterday. There was a woman at MIT, she was a journalist, she was a scientist, and she was trying to find any information that she could about civil rights folks, not just the leaders, but the folks who participated in the civil rights, resistance and movement and marched and sat in and did those sort of things. She couldn't find anything. So she called me and asked me if any of the respondents that I had spoke with talked about participating in the civil rights movement. And she wanted to know if psychologically they fared better than folks who didn't do anything, who didn't participate, and who were basically just victims. And I said, well, I don't know. I think everybody who went through these racial traumatic events didn't come out unscathed. But again, it goes back to the degree of which you're suffering. So I went back in my research, even though it's been many, many years. I still have everything, my notes, my field notes, everything. And I realized that about 20 folks that I interviewed who talked about participating in the civil rights movement were the most vocal, the most empowered. They were really like, you had to resist, you had to do it, I did this, I did that. They had a fire in them that the folks who didn't have, that didn't fight, didn't have. And it really made me think, that's my next book. To find out, because we have these young folks, and you think about the fact that you get tired of fighting. You get tired of fighting, you get tired of, trying to explain to folks, what's going on, but you have to fight. There's no way that you can't fight, because not fighting doesn't get you anywhere either. It may never change, not in my lifetime maybe, or maybe in yours, but that doesn't matter. It's important to fight, because if you don't fight, then you just look like a victim, and you feel like a victim. Having empowering experience of pushing back can really help. And that's what I discovered in the few folks that I look back at. So, that's something that I need to do, is to really look back at and interview some of these folks who participated from all different SESs, right? Folks that, basically just went out as a young kid, didn't tell their mother that they were protesting, but went out and did something and participated. But just because you resist doesn't mean that bad things don't happen to you, right? As a part of the same interview, the woman shared with me, from MIT, this journalist, shared with me that there was a woman that she spoke with, or was getting ready to speak to, who was about 12 years old, and she participated in a protest at their local theater. And so there were about 20-some girls between the age of 12 and 15. And so the cops came, and they rounded up all the little girls and put them in a van and took them about 30 miles out of town. And they were in one room without any water, no way to use the bathroom. They were given raw food. They were there for 2 months. Their family did not know where they were. There wasn't any trial. There wasn't anything. And after 2 months, there was some attention that was given to the fact that they had all these young girls. I can't even begin to imagine in my mind what they went through. So this woman finally got free. They released them. Nobody went to jail for kidnapping and holding these young girls hostage, 12 to 15 years old. Later on in her life, and this is why it's really important that we really be very careful about identifying these folks. Later in life, she said she was in college, and she looked at a book. She opened it up, and there was her face and her name. And she said she lost it. Because now she said, oh my God, are people here going to know that this is me? What's going to happen to me now? So she went on and she did okay. But just imagine, right? You've gone through this traumatic event with these other 22 little girls who are just out there trying to make things better. And you end up in a room for 2 months and your family doesn't even know where you are, to open up a book and see your face. shouldn't have happened. You know, and I said all that to say, and it's really important when I talk about this stuff to really bring it to now. You know, because just to talk about it in the past, it doesn't really bring home how prevalent this stuff still is for these folks, right? And that there's this intergenerational transmission, because the way that we're socialized as human beings is we watch folks. So I watched my mother interact with folks. I watched my father interact with folks. And I'm getting these kind of like unverbalized cues about the way that I should act. And so, that's a cute picture, right? I love that picture. Every time I see it, it makes me smile. So the folks that live through this era are consciously or unconsciously transmitting that trauma. I mean, the literature is pretty, you know, compelling in terms of the way that it gets processed and passed on, right? It's through the socialization, watching family members, you know, listening to conversations, words of warning. And there is a team at Mount Sinai, Rachel Yehuda. She's doing some great genetic research, and it shows evidence that the transmission of this less stress-related gene, epigenetics, I think she called it, and cortisol. So I would really like to keep an eye on that. And I would really like for some research to be done in the African American community, because like I said, absolutely, Holocaust survivors went through an awful lot. And they survived, right? And they're getting the help and treatment that they need. But African Americans, there's not a whole lot of data about their experiences and what they're still dealing with, right? And how it's negatively impacting their lives and their health. So, you know, I always try to leave my students with, well, what can we do? I want folks to feel empowered, because there is something that you can do. And it's important to do something. And I remind my students that during the civil rights movement, there were young white students who didn't have to participate, who weren't under fire, but gave up their lives, their livelihood, their well-being to get out there and fight for social justice. And that's really important. There's no way that the civil rights movement would have happened if it weren't for folks who wanted to be a part of the movement. So everybody, it should be invested, right, in things getting better. So what I would like to see done is to protect these young women who are now elderly adults and get their names out of those newspaper articles. And those folks who were raped and had children and had to bear the burden of raising their children from a rape and all the stuff that goes along with that, and who see these men go on and live their lives and have families and not be prosecuted. Our rape limitation laws, they really need to be changed. There's a 50-year limit. During this time, folks couldn't go to the justice system and get any kind of justice. You know, any man that was arrested that actually might be put in jail pleaded insanity and was able to leave. In these triggers, these segregation stress syndrome triggers, you know, this police brutality, again, it just reminds folks of what it was like when, you know, your son could be walking down the street and, you know, you say something that is considered to be disrespectful, and the next thing you know, the police are showing up at your doorstep ready to kind of beat you, kill you, and burn your family's house down just because you said something or insinuated that someone was mistreating you. And as I said, you know, provide training for these mental health clinicians, like this cultural competence. You know, you listen to folks. You feel like they're being respected. You give them back some of the dignity that they lost as a result of some of the stuff that they went through. And really, I think there needs to be more research on these survivors. I think we have a really great opportunity to kind of not just figure out what goes on here with these folks, but to also think about all the places around the world where people are dealing with some of the same kind of violence, like for years and years and years, you know? And we have a well pool of folks done in the right way that can really offer us some answers as to help other people as well. I had an opportunity to go to South Africa for 2 months, and while I was there, I interviewed about 20 folks who lived through apartheid. And I saw the same thing on their faces, that same look of pain, that same trauma, right? That same long-term kind of generational or psychological damage from these racial traumatic effects. So it's not just like, you know, an American thing. It really can be a global thing. Does that make sense? Good. All right. Thanks, folks. Thank you. Oh my goodness, did I talk that long? What time is it?
We do have some classes coming in this room, but
Okay.
we have some time.
You mentioned that there's a question about those who resisted and whether it's in defense, and I know that wasn't the focus of your research, but I was wondering if you noticed any like reduction in PTSD symptoms or any sort of like physiological differences in people who did resist.
There was less evidence of it. So remember when I talked about the severity of the symptoms, right? I didn't realize this until this woman called me a couple of weeks ago and asked me, and then I had to look back at my data, and I realized that those folks didn't seem to suffer with as many symptoms as folks who didn't do anything. And women seem to fare the worst out of this whole thing. Because I noticed that it was mostly men who resisted and participated, right, who seemed to kind of still have that fire. And there were a few women, but and if you think about the sample size, right, it were mostly women, but it was the men who did most of the resistance and were still empowered, while women, even though they were the bigger group, didn't fare as well with this stuff. And it makes me think about like the gender thing going on, and you know, the possibility of sexual assault and how that all gets played out, right? I hope that answers your question. Yes.
There's evolving kind of therapy called sensory motor psychotherapy. Is that something that you've looked into, or whether or not might help some of these?
Could you describe it for me a little?
It talks about, basically the idea is that sometimes even when you can't remember a memory, the body remembers. So for a lot of people, it would be, say that you were being raped and you wanted to punch someone and you couldn't do it at the moment. In therapy, you will notice that your arms are moving, and the therapist will help you move that arm to release that. And it helps when, a lot of the times, new research has shown that when people go through therapy could be re-traumatizing the person by talking about this again and again and again. And what really helps is slowing it down to really get at the feeling, what your body is feeling at the moment, and releasing that emotion.
I think that might help for some folks. But I think with these folks that I've done my research on, I don't think so much, right? I think that if it could help, you got to get them in the door first, right? Because that's huge, right? To be sitting there and have someone guide you through some kind of like therapy like that where you're punching and trying to get it all out, right? I think that maybe for younger folks who have gone through trauma that might be helpful, but just getting these folks to trust doctors, clinicians, you know, therapists who respect what they have to say. And even if maybe talking about it too many times might re-traumatize you, but never having been able to talk about what happened to you has got to be worse. You get what I mean? Yeah. So I think that that's part of kind of, and I appreciate that question, I think that's part of kind of that training and that cultural competence that comes along with really kind of gauging who these folks are and what their experience has been, and figuring out a way to help them in a way that they're going to be comfortable with, because that's really all that matters, is that they get the support and the help that they need to live their life without so much fear and stress and pain. And if folks can come up with something like that, I think that would be great. But, you know, knowing what I know about them, I don't know that they would really, I mean, you're talking about my mama, right? She don't want to do nothing, okay? And so anything new, I don't want to meditate. It's too much. No. Give me my Bible. So this is what we're dealing with here. And that's to be respected. that's to be respected because that is what's gotten them through. Their strong spiritual belief in God and the black church. I can't even begin to tell you how instrumental that was. Without that, I don't know that black folks would have really made it, right? And that's why I'm saying, when my mama says that stuff, I respect her because I know what she's been through. And again, that's what I'm saying. Now, if you want to get a Bible and sit with them and have them read their Bible and talk about, yeah. So the therapy has to be created in a way that really brings what they believe and what has worked for them into the practice of helping them. And that really shows you and them that you respect their experience. I mean, something as small as that, right? I hope that.
From your perspective, how would you describe a good cultural competency program at healthcare setting? What would it entail?
I think it would entail a whole lot of historical data where you can even listen to some of these folks, right? I think it would have to involve you or anybody as a person really being able to look at a person and see their humanity. See their humanity, not an elderly black woman, but her humanity as an elderly black woman, right? And being able to understand culturally what folks of this generation have really kind of done and lived through, and the ways in which they've dealt with stuff and coped with stuff. So you can take those coping ways, those strategies, just like I just mentioned this young woman here, take those coping ways and incorporate it into what you're doing. So let's say, for instance, and I'm no expert on this, I mean, I talk to these folks, but I think it would be really important to establish a way for the clinician to be comfortable with the people that they're going to be working with. So you can't go into a room with a person that's just come in and you haven't had any experience interacting with that group so that you're comfortable when you go in there, right? That's the first thing. Some kind of way, figuring out a way to get comfortable with this group and understanding who they are. Giving them dignity and making them feel and believing and feeling that you really care about what they went through. And you understand, and whatever they say, it's respected, it's not questioned, right? Old folks ain't interested in taking a whole lot of medication from doctors because they don't trust doctors, all right? My mother tells me all the time, I told you not to take that medicine. I told you can't take medicine. So knowing something like that. So I think it would really take some folks of color who have that lived experience to come in and talk to these clinicians and really kind of help them come up with a cultural toolkit that you can open up and use so that when these folks come to your room and to your place, that you're prepared to help them, so that they'll come back. And so they'll trust you, because trust is a huge issue. Huge. 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 I'm sorry. I had to say it 3 times because it's huge, okay? I don't trust you. You seem like a nice girl, but my experience has showed me that all that niceness, that needle coming my way, there's something in it that's going to hurt me. Because I don't know what it is, and I don't trust it. I'll tell you an experience that I had, all right? Real quick. I went to a doctor. I have a Ph.D., all right? I know how to look stuff up. She treated me with such disrespect. I had to beg her to give me a biopsy on some sore I had. She didn't want to do anything to help me. She told me that she couldn't be my doctor anymore because I asked too many questions. I did not know that I had a life-threatening illness, a horrible reaction to penicillin, and I was dying. I went to another doctor. Now, this is a doctor that's got a degree and is in charge of making sure that I don't die, who pretty much dismissed me. This is what black folks have had to deal with. This is not some paranoia. These are actual facts. I have a doctorate. I'm a professor. I'm a writer. I'm able to voice stuff, right? That wasn't enough. I still wasn't good enough. And she kicked me out. I went to another doctor who basically told me that if I had any of these symptoms, I had to get to the emergency room because my organs were shutting down. And this woman didn't have any problem dismissing me from her office. This is the stuff that folks deal with. Your degrees and your suit and your insurance, it doesn't matter. That's what you're dealing with. It's a lot. And it has to take a certain amount of commitment to want to even do that. Because it's no easy task, right? And just I think about all the folks who don't have a voice, who can't look stuff up, who don't feel powerful enough to speak back, who just sit there and it costs them their lives, like it almost cost me my life, right? I know you got, I'm sorry. I could go on forever. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.